Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I like to discuss where we go from here in removing trade barriers set up by the economic vandals in the Tory party as part of their Brexit ideology. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So again, seventh anniversary of the day when the UK voted to apply economic sanctions to itself. Earlier on, I did a video on looking at the past. This is going to be looking at the future. You know, it's like you just think 7 years, and Brexiteers still can't agree with each other, never mind us, about what Brexit even means. Still, we're closer to being able to have a sensible conversation about it now, albeit rather too late for the easy way out. And I thought I'd kick off with a speech by Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, Nick Thomas Symonds. So we know that Labour are saying no to rejoin the EU single market or customs union. They can't in the next parliament anyway, really. So, yes, it annoys some, but let's park it there for now. Are we moving towards? That's what I care about. What's the direction of travel? Because you need, for any large campaign, you need to find allies. You can't screen allies based on, do you agree with me on everything? That doesn't work. We've seen that fringe groups doesn't work. Direction of, are you going in the same direction as me? Right, we will ride together then. What I want to see is progress. We have raised trade barriers. Those trade barriers are harming our trade, as the name implies, which means we make less money, certainly less profit, so tax revenues are lower. We have a Brexit premium in our inflation, which also hits tax revenues indirectly. This is because not only do we have less money for public services, but those public services will cost more to run due to the inflation, meaning a double whammy. Public services cost more, we have less money for them. Uh-oh. We're not going to compensate by trying to trade more elsewhere. The trade deals we've been getting are making things worse and are based on the idea of selling more of our stuff to people far away who don't have as much money as the people right next door. And I will point out, some of Labour's statements aside, they are not pretending we can. You do not hear Labour ministers saying, oh, we're just going to trade more with Mongolia. That does not occur. David Lammy has said that he is going to prioritise EU relations. I've spoken about that recently. Prioritise EU relations. None of that markets around the world crap. Yes, of course we want to trade more with markets around the world. But the focus is the EU. That is Labour's focus. They've been clear about it. Nick Thomas Symonds likewise has been talking about Labour prioritising trade barriers with the EU. To put it into context, when asked about a possible US trade deal, I mean, this was the big thing for the Brexiteers. Oh, we're going to get the US trade deal. That'd be worth it. Labour are saying to the concept of a US trade deal, which may or may not emerge during their time in government, we do not know. We know that at the moment Biden has gone, America's not really ready to start talking about trade deals. That was the position when he became president. Will it still be the position in a couple of years' time? Don't know. But on the prospect of a US trade deal, Labour are basically saying, sure, can't rule it out. Why not? But when asked about EU trade, they are champing at the bit to get it going. It has been made explicitly clear they understand the need to deal with European trade barriers to get our economy moving again. So for those asking, do Labour really get it? Yes, they do. When it comes to Labour negotiating better deals with the EU, people are naturally wary of the risks of the so-called cherry picking, which the Tories managed, so the reason was obvious enough. The Tories obviously failed in their cherry picking of escapades, because if you want any serious negotiating party to agree to something, you have to offer them something they want in return for something you want. And the EU are very serious negotiators, so there is every chance that Labour will attempt to renegotiate some deals which do not succeed, because the EU will go, well, we don't really want to. But that's not a reason not to try. But it is worth pointing out a few things as well. First, the EU offered us better deals even when the Tories were conducting negotiations. Remember, the Brexit we ended up with was not just hard because it meant leaving the EU and single market, which shouldn't have been necessary and wasn't part of the referendum vote. It was, they added extra bits on as well. The EU offered Boris Johnson better terms and he turned them down. And Boris Johnson was being rude about the EU, turning up to talk totally unprepared. Well, if the EU would offer good deals to Johnson, why wouldn't they do so for Starmer? After all, if it was in the EU's interest then, if they were going, well, no, this would be better for all of us, why not now? The EU offered, for example, visa-free touring for performers, for musicians, for example. So this commitment by Labour is not cherry-picking, because they're talking about that. They're making a big thing about, musicians should have it easier touring around Europe. And that's not cherry picking. The EU had offered it. Now, it's worth remembering that this might not be as awesome as some people think, because some people are going, oh, so if musicians can have like free movement around Europe, can I just pack a recorder into my flight luggage, claim to be a musician, and off I go? Remember the German band who were recently stopped from entering Britain to perform, even though they had their visas all sorted, because one of them was also a gardener? There might be some wrinkles like that, but a better deal is a better deal. We've also had David Lammy talking about needing to look at freedom of movement. Just bear in mind that it will be in line with political reality, which means if you want it to move faster, talk to more target voters about Brexit. Or just wait for younger people and EU citizens to get the vote, or both. Second, on the issue of cherry picking. So there is a difference between trying to cherry pick the areas the UK wants to achieve progress in and ignoring what the EU is interested in. Obviously, that's never going to work. But some people think that attempting to negotiate a narrow agreement is cherry picking. No, that's called a bilateral agreement. The EU have bilateral agreements with lots of countries. The UK is by far and away the largest economy anywhere near the EU, which is not a member. If they will negotiate bilateral agreements with a medium-sized economy at the other side of the world, of course they will do so for the very large economy on their doorstep. Granted, they don't want to get bogged down, I suspect, in Swiss levels of individual agreements, but it doesn't mean they won't. We have a lot of scope for discussing a wide range of issues. It's just that the agreement has to either be something the EU wants or has to be compensated with something the EU wants. Because otherwise it is cherry picking. That's what cherry picking is. It's saying, we want this, and the EU goes, well, we don't. Well, and the EU then saying, well, hang on, I'll tell you what, if you want that, well, we want this. No, we're only interested in discussing what we want. That's cherry picking. That doesn't fly. I talked about how we might leverage better terms on trade recently with offers on a security deal because, you know, in terms of trade, we don't really have a lot to bargain with, but on security, we do. Well, in the article, which I will link below, Simmons basically says this will be Labour's pitch. It's like, oh, you know, we want to negotiate better trade terms and we can offer a security deal. That's how negotiations should work. It's possible some people doubt what Labour can achieve because we have judged the dismal failures of the Tories over the past few years. And it's sometimes difficult to separate out what failures were down to the fact that we are the smaller market and also less experienced negotiators. Although bear in mind, we have negotiators who were EU negotiators at one time. It's difficult to separate that out from what was just Tory uselessness. But I would say don't judge it too harshly based on how the Tories managed. Because, and I cannot emphasise this strongly enough, they were a bunch of posh, entitled, lazy, impatient imbeciles. The third consideration is that the overriding concern of the EU during the Brexit process was that it should not destabilise the wider project. The likes of Nigel Farage and John Redwood were hoping that Brexit would cause lots of other countries to break up because what they really hate is the EU. Doesn't matter whether they're in or outside of it. What they really hate is the EU. What they were really hoping for, the Daily Express crowd, was that the EU broke up. The EU don't want other members leaving. But it is now widely accepted that this is not going to happen, despite the Express maintaining its insistence that the EU is going to fracture any day now, next Tuesday, maximum, and pointing out any friction within the bloc as a sign that another country is about to leave. Because that's their attitude. They think if you're going to have an argument with someone, it means you're going to leave. Oh, it's Poland this week, by the way. But all the evidence is that EU appreciation is higher than ever. Even anti-EU groups, such as France's National Front Party, they've had to drop policies of leaving the EU and just causing trouble from inside instead. This means the EU can negotiate with the UK now as a normal third country, as opposed to a third country which might pose a threat to their own stability. They can now just view us as a third country with whom we want closer relations. We saw this in the Windsor Framework Agreement, for example. You know, there was it's quite minor relatively, but there were concessions from the EU that were unthinkable a few years earlier. That Boris Johnson, no matter how he'd approached it, would never have got. And again, I will emphasise, nobody's talking about the EU giving us something out of pity. You know, Starmer's not going to go there with the saddest puppy he can find and go, please. Any agreement struck will need to be in the interest of both the EU and the UK. But that in itself is new. Up until now, all the agreements struck with both the EU and around the world have been in the interest of the other side. The only thing Boris Johnson ever asked for was positive Daily Express headlines. So we may also need to be patient as well, because before we left the EU, we were all saying that decent agreements can take years. Well, yes, they do, and they will. Thomas Simmons recently attacked his opposite number, Kemi Badenoch, for ignoring the impacts of Brexit, blaming others for the trade problems. Now, what I would say to those who are thinking, hang on a minute, are we really going to get much progress here? I would say, imagine the situation a few years' time. So Thomas Simmons Kemi Badenoch basically has been telling businesses who have been complaining about Brexit, there's nothing wrong with your trade, you're all just too lazy. Nothing to do with Brexit, go out and trade more, you lazy beggars. So, Thomas Simmons has basically said, look, this is Kemi Badenoch just making excuses. This is a disgraceful way to behave. Labour are not going to do this. So imagine, a few years' time, he's the Secretary of State now. The Labour government working with the EU in the spirit of mutual benefit. But Brexit, of course, is still creating trade barriers. Of course it is. If we're outside the customs union, paperwork, checks and delays are still a feature of our trade. If we're outside the single market, paperwork, checks, delays, and even prohibitions are a feature of our trade, as well as potentially some tariffs here or there, although there are ways to smooth that out. So Thomas Simmons is told that businesses are saying that Brexit is still causing them problems. He can hardly turn around and say, no, we fixed it all. Brexit is not an issue. Go out and trade. Can he? He can hardly say that, especially after what he said this week. So one thing is guaranteed. We're going to get a government who will be rather more upfront about how Brexit is impacting our trade, even if not quite so upfront about what the long-term solution must be. But a feature of democracy is that it's short-term anyway, one parliament at a time, especially in the UK. I'll put it this simply. At the end of this parliament, whatever it is, whenever it is, at the end of this parliament, our trade will be worse off than when it began. That will be provably the case. At the end of the next parliament, it will be better. Again, the data will show that. And the same with the parliament after that. And it must. It's not blind faith, because I'm a Labour supporter. It's obvious. It doesn't matter whether you trust Labour or not. It is a fact they cannot win elections if they do not win the economic argument. And in government, the only way Labour can ever win the economic argument is delivering. They don't get the press covering for them or pretending that things are fine when they're not. They never get that. So they have to actually deliver. People have to feel the benefits. In the next parliament, we can get gains purely by stabilising politics, picking off the unnecessarily hard Brexit terms and working to rebuild bridges. After that, though, more will be needed. Again, it's thinking about that direction of travel. What is the direction of travel? Are you travelling the same direction as me? Then you are my ally. Now, if at some point that stops, fine, you get off the bus. But it can't stop, because as soon as it does stop, Labour lose. So after that, more is going to be needed if Labour want to keep winning. And I think they do want to keep winning, for a while yet anyway. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.